My name is Gaynor, and until 2 weeks ago, I thought that my life was quite arranged, that everything in it was going along the planned path, and that I myself was a person who knew what she wanted and stood firmly on her feet. I had a stable job at Marshall Financial Group, one of the country's largest Fortune 500 companies, with branches in almost every state. I lived in a spacious, bright apartment in downtown Boston with my boyfriend, whom I had been dating for 3 years. Tyler came into my life in my senior year of college, and we've been inseparable ever since. Or so I thought. After graduation, I was hired by my dream company as a financial analyst, and Tyler moved in with me when I signed a lease on a new apartment, believing that this would be another step towards our future together. But then came the night when everything collapsed. It was the birthday of Madison, one of my closest friends in Boston and a colleague at the same time. We booked a private room in one of the most prestigious bars in the city, where it was cozy, expensive, and atmospheric. The hum of voices, the clink of glasses, the flickering light of chandeliers reflected in the eyes of laughing people, all this created a sense of celebration, lightness, and carefree, to which I completely succumbed, not even suspecting that in a few minutes, my whole world would turn upside down. Before we continue, I am very curious. Which country are you from, dear listeners? Write in the comments where you are listening to us from. Enjoy listening. At the moment when I decided to go to the bathroom, making my way through the crowd of guests, I noticed a couple huddled together in a dim corner near the wardrobe. Their silhouettes merged into one whole. The dimmed light cast warm reflections on them, and I, unwittingly, held my gaze on them for a second longer than I should have. Something about the man's silhouette seemed familiar to me. It took me a moment to realize that I was looking at him, but as soon as he turned his head slightly, my stomach clenched with an unpleasant premonition. It was Tyler. My Tyler. The very man I loved and trusted was holding some blonde I'd never seen before in his arms and kissing her as if the rest of the world didn't exist. The seconds turned into hours, and I stood rooted to the spot as something unfolded before my eyes that my mind refused to accept. I do not know how long it took me to regain control of my body, but when I finally managed to take a breath, it was not just a breath. It was a piercing, furious scream. "Are you kidding?" My voice rang through the room, and several people turned around, stopping talking. Tyler jerked as if he'd been electrocuted and abruptly pulled away from his companion. His eyes widened in horror when he saw me. "Gaynor, it's not what you think," his voice faltered. But there was still an attempt to justify himself, to explain, to turn the situation in his favor. I crossed my arms over my chest, feeling rage boil up inside, filling my entire being. "Don't you dare say it's not what it seems," I spat, feeling my voice tremble, "because it looks exactly like my boyfriend is cheating on me in the middle of my friend's party." "Gaynor, please." He took a step toward me, held out his hand as if he wanted to touch me, but I recoiled. "Let's just get out of here and talk." I laughed, but even to me it sounded hollow and broken. "Leave? You mean go home? To my apartment, which I'm paying for? Are you living there because I'm an idiot who believed you loved me?" Tyler swallowed, but didn't say anything. "I want your things to disappear from my apartment by tomorrow," I said slowly, enunciating each word clearly, and felt my anger tighten into a tight lump in my chest, but it didn't weaken. "I don't care where you go." I turned around and left the bar, ignoring his voice calling my name, the noise, and the stares. Madison ran out after me, grabbed my arm, and helped me hail a taxi. I didn't cry that night. I was too angry. The tears came later, when I was left alone in an apartment filled with his belongings, which now seemed alien to me, as if they were part of someone else's life. Over the next 2 weeks, I immersed myself in work, took on additional projects, and stayed late rather than return home, where emptiness overwhelmed me. I didn't miss Tyler because the anger was still too fresh, but every day I realized more and more clearly that there was nothing holding me back in Boston anymore. The only place I really cared about was in Pinewood, a small town in upstate New York. The house that my father built with his own hands, which was left to me as a legacy when he died of cancer 8 years ago. I was only 19 when my mom called me at 3 in the morning and told me that Dad was getting worse. I immediately took off, got in the car, and made the 6-hour drive home. But by the time I got there, he was gone. After the funeral, Mom couldn't stay in that house for a long time, with too many memories in every room. She went to live with her sister in California, and she left it to me, the house my father had built for us. His way of making sure that I always have a place that I can call my own, no matter what this world is. And now, 8 years later, standing at the window of my Boston apartment, I looked out at the evening city and realized that it was time to return. I went back to college and tried to focus on my studies, but thoughts of home wouldn't let me rest. It was the very period when I tried to pretend that life went on as usual, that the pain of losing my father would ease over time, and the emptiness in my chest would be filled with something new. But in reality, I just went deeper into my studies, trying desperately not to think about the fact that my house no longer seemed as warm and secure as it had been before. Mom still lived there alone, and even though I knew it was hard for her, we rarely talked about Dad because any mention of him was too painful for both of us. But a year after his death, she called me and stunned me with news that I wasn't ready for. She got married again. I remember clutching the phone in my hand, feeling my blood freeze in my veins as an icy lump spread in my chest, which I could neither push out nor swallow. Robert. His name was Robert, and he had 2 teenage children from a previous marriage. Mom spoke quickly, excitedly, as if she was in a hurry to explain, as if she sensed my imminent reaction and wanted to smooth out the corners in advance. She assured me that he was a good man, that he cared about her, that he made her smile again. But I hardly heard these words, because the only thought that was beating in my mind at that moment was unbearably cruel. Too soon. Too soon after Dad. I couldn't imagine that now, when I arrive home, some strangers will live there, occupy rooms that were once ours, sit at the same dining table where the whole family spent Christmas. Fill this house with their voices, their smells, their lives, which had nothing to do with me. I shuddered at the thought, but Mom begged me, said she couldn't live alone anymore, that she deserved to be happy, and I loved her too much to argue. In the end, I couldn't stop her from moving on. I agreed that they could move, but deep down, it seemed to me that this was the last nail in the coffin of my childhood, my family, my home. After graduating from college, I chose a job in Boston, and although, of course, career prospects played an important role in this decision, the real reason lay elsewhere. I no longer felt that Pinewood was my home. In the rare moments when I went there for the holidays, it seemed to me that I was intruding into someone else's life. My mother was busy with Robert and his children, Emma and Jason, who, of course, were quite polite and tried not to show me that I was superfluous here. But this feeling was still in the air. I no longer fit into the picture that I once considered my own. And now, sitting in a half-empty apartment in Boston, flipping through my phone and ignoring Tyler's messages, I suddenly realized that it was time to go back. Marshoreline Financial Group had a branch in Albany, just 30 minutes away from Pinewood, and if I applied for a transfer, I would have a chance not only to leave this city, which no longer seemed like home to me, but also to return to where my real place once was. I could make that house my own again. I could start all over again. The next morning, I called my boss, Mike, and asked for a meeting. "Gaynor, what's on your mind?" "What is it?" he asked when I sat down in front of his desk. I didn't beat around the bush. "I need to request a transfer to the Albany branch," I said firmly, looking him straight in the eye. Mike studied me for a few seconds, then took a deep breath and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "You're one of our best analysts, Gaynor," he said finally. "I don't want to lose you at all. Give me some time. I'll make some calls and see what I can come up with." It took 3 days before he confirmed my transfer. The salary would be slightly lower, but considering that the cost of living in Pinewood was several times less than in Boston, I could put up with it. I called my mom that night. "Mom, I need to tell you something," I said when she answered. "What happened?" There was a hint of concern in her voice. "I'm moving back into the house." There was a pause. "Oh," was all she said. In 2 weeks, I continued. I just wanted to let you know in advance so that you can prepare my room. Now the pause dragged on, and there was something tense in that silence, as if Mom was trying to find the words but didn't know how to say them correctly. Your room, she hesitated. Emma's been using this room since she went to college. I gritted my teeth, but tried to keep my voice calm. Well, she'll have to move into one of the other bedrooms. This is my home, Mom. Of course, she replied hastily. Just unexpected. But we will be glad to see you at home. Something in her voice told me otherwise, but I dismissed the thought. Great, see you soon. When I hung up, I couldn't shake the feeling that my return home wasn't going to be as easy as I'd hoped. But the decision was made. The next 2 weeks flew by in a blur. I terminated the lease, sold most of the furniture, and packed up the things that really mattered to me. My friends threw me a farewell party at our favorite bar, certainly not the one where I caught Tyler cheating. We drank cocktails, laughed, and reminisced about the past years. And even though I knew I would miss them, deep down I knew I was making the right choice. I was on my way home. But was this house still mine? The drive to Pinewood took almost 6 hours, and by the time I turned onto a familiar street, I had a tight knot in my stomach. The closer I got to the house, the stronger this feeling became, a mixture of anxiety, anticipation, and a slight unpleasant tremor, similar to the one that occurs before an important conversation, when you know in advance that it will not bring anything good. I slowed down at the curb and held my breath for a moment, allowing myself a couple of seconds to look around and accept that this is where I have to start a new chapter of my life. The 2-story colonial house on Maple Street looked almost the same as in my memories, but something about it was different, barely perceptible, but noticeably changed its appearance. The blue paint on the facade seemed a little darker than I remembered, as if it had been updated, but the wrong shade had been chosen. And the flower beds, which my mother always took such careful care of, now looked neglected, with overgrown weeds between the flowers. There was something strangely symbolic about the site. I was about to open the car door when the front door of the house opened, and my mom came out on the porch. At first, my heart sank. She looked older than the last time I saw her at Christmas. New wrinkles around her eyes, more gray streaks in her brown hair, although otherwise, she was still the same mother I remembered from childhood. "Gaynor," she said, coming down the steps toward me, arms outstretched in greeting. "Welcome home." I got up to meet her and hugged her, inhaling the familiar scent of her vanilla perfume, which immediately brought back a whole wave of memories. The nights when I fell asleep as a child, burrowing into her shoulder, weekends when we baked cookies together, and the warm scent of vanilla and cinnamon wafted through the kitchen. "Hi, Mom," I said softly. Over my shoulder, I noticed movement at the entrance. Robert stood in the doorway with his arms crossed over his chest, with an expression on his face that, however, expressed nothing. He was a tall man, with thinning hair and always slightly furrowed eyebrows, which gave the impression that he was unhappy with something, even in moments when everything was going well. I never really disliked him, but I also felt warmth for him. He was just my mother's husband, a part of that new life, which I did not consider myself to be. "Gaynor," he nodded, his gaze skimming over my car, which was packed with boxes and suitcases, before returning to me. "It looks like you brought your whole life with you." "Only the essentials," I replied, trying to smile. "Mostly clothes and work items." He chuckled, but didn't say anything. He did not offer to help with the bags, nor did he ask any questions that would have at least a drop of concern. "Well," he finally said, "Emma moved her things to the guest room. Your old rooms are ready." Mom gave him a quick glance that I couldn't decipher, then turned to me and took my hand. "Come in, dear. You must be tired after the journey." I nodded and followed her, stepping through the threshold of a house that should have been my home, but now seemed alien. Inside, everything was both familiar and strange. The layout remained the same, but the furniture was not the same as before, and my mother's favorite decorative knickknacks were gone, replaced by things I didn't recognize. The paintings that used to hang in the living room, family photos, landscapes that Dad bought from local artists, are also gone. It seemed that they were trying to remake the house for a new way of life, erasing the traces of the past. As we passed through the dining room, footsteps sounded from above, and a second later, Emma and Jason appeared on the stairs. Jason, who was now 17, had grown to almost 6 feet tall, and even though I remembered him as a gangly teenager, he was now a tall guy with confident eyes. He nodded at me, a little awkwardly. "Hey." "Hey, Jason," I replied. "You've grown up a lot." Emma, who was 19, stood next to him, arms crossed over her chest in immaculately tailored designer clothes. Her expression immediately made it clear to me that she wasn't thrilled with my appearance. "So you're really staying?" "What is it?" she asked, and there was no curiosity in her voice, but rather annoyance. "Emma?" Mom shot her a warning look. "Well, it doesn't sound like a secret," she snorted. "I had to move my stuff all day to the tiny back room." I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "It's good to see you too, Emma." Dinner that evening was held in a tense atmosphere. Robert talked about his job at the local bank. Mom tried to keep up the conversation. Jason mumbled monosyllabic answers from time to time, and Emma picked at her plate, casting sidelong glances at me. "Okay," Robert finally said, putting down his fork. "How long are you going to stay?" I froze with my fork raised to my mouth, then slowly lowered it and looked him straight in the eye. "I'm not staying," I said clearly. "I'm moving out. This is my permanent home now." He exchanged a quick glance with Mom, and even though she immediately turned away, pretending to be focused on her food, I noticed something like concern in her eyes. Of course," he said with a neutral expression on his face. "It's just that we're used to certain arrangements here." "I'm sure we can all adjust," I replied flatly, cutting off any further discussion. "I'll be working full-time at the Albany branch, so I won't be home much during the day." There was silence in the room, and I felt the atmosphere getting even thicker. I put down the appliances and looked at my mom. "I'm tired from the road. Can I come up?" "Of course, dear," she said hurriedly. I got up from the table, feeling their eyes following me as I climbed the stairs. When I reached my room and closed the door behind me, I finally managed to exhale. I came back, but this place was no longer mine. "I had to give up the big room because of you," Emma blurted out, defiantly crossing her arms over her chest as soon as I entered the dining room the next morning. Her gaze was cold, her lips pursed into a displeased line, and there was resentment in her voice, as if I had really done something unfair against her. "I've been using it for 2 years, and now I'm locked in this closet in the guest room." I didn't answer right away, allowing myself a second to digest her words. There was a tense silence in the room, and I noticed how my mother nervously lowered her eyes, and Robert just cleared his throat, but did not say anything. They weren't going to interfere. They weren't going to tell Emma that she was overreacting. They weren't going to remind her that this was my house and my room, which I had every right to return to. "Actually," I said slowly, choosing my words carefully so that they sounded even but firm, "this whole house belongs to me." I deliberately paused to make sure everyone heard me. "Dad left it to me in his will, so technically, I can choose any room I want." Emma stood up abruptly, so quickly that her chair skidded across the floor with a loud screech and almost tipped over. Her eyes were flashing. "That's nonsense," she shouted, clenching her fists. "I've prepared everything in that college room. My desk, my dressing table, everything. And now I'm going to have to cram it all into a room half as big because Princess Gaynor has decided to grace us with her presence." I didn't even have time to answer. She turned around and stormed out of the room, slamming the door so hard that dishes rattled in the cupboard. I exhaled slowly and looked at my mom, but she just shook her head, clearly displeased not with Emma's trick, but with my words. "Did you have to make her angry?" "What is it?" she asked reproachfully, tiredly rubbing the bridge of her nose. I blinked, not immediately realizing what had just happened. "Did I make her angry?" I asked, feeling a wave of irritation rise in me. "Mom, she started complaining as soon as I came in." Mom sighed heavily and tiredly ran her hand through her hair. "Don't do this today," she said softly, but there was firmness in her voice. "You're tired from the road. Everything will look better tomorrow." But the next day, and then the day after, nothing looked any better. I got a new job at the Albany branch and immersed myself in learning about local processes, even though the job was essentially the same as in Boston. The new office was smaller and the people seemed more relaxed, but that didn't stop me from quickly getting into a rhythm, understanding my work processes, and feeling confident in my professional field again. In addition to work, I began to make connections with people I hadn't seen in years, several former classmates who still lived in Pinewood, including my best friend from high school, Megan, who now worked as a nurse at the local hospital. It had been 2 weeks since I moved in when I returned from work and saw Emma decorating the living room with garlands and balloons. "What's going on here?" I asked, putting my laptop bag on the table and looking around at the colorful decorations that didn't match the interior at all. Emma didn't even look at me, but continued to fasten one of the ribbons. "It's my birthday," she replied indifferently. I blinked, not immediately sure how to react. "Oh, I see. This Saturday?" "Yeah." I tried to be polite, despite the fact that Emma gave no reason for friendly communication. "It's cool. Should I get you something?" She snorted, crossing her arms. "No need. You won't be here." I raised my eyebrows. "I'm sorry, what?" Before I could get an answer, Mom came into the room. "Gaynor, honey, can I talk to you for a minute?" I followed her to the back porch, which used to be my favorite place in the house, the one where my mom and I used to sit in the evenings, watch the sunset, and talk about anything. Now it was filled with Robert's tools and gardening tools, and there was no trace of the former secluded atmosphere. "What's the matter?" I asked, feeling my irritation coming on. Mom locked her fingers together and squeezed them a little, as she always did when she was about to ask for something she knew I wouldn't want to listen to. "Emma invites friends to her birthday party," she began, choosing her words carefully. "She'd like to have the whole house to herself." I stared at her, feeling the indignation slowly boiling up inside. "Are you serious?" I asked, already knowing the answer. Mom smiled faintly, obviously hoping that I would take it calmly. "It's only for a few hours, Gaynor. You can go to the movies or have dinner with Megan." I shook my head, smiling incredulously. "Are you really asking me to leave my house for Emma's party?" She sighed heavily. "Please don't complicate the situation. Everything's been so tense since you moved in." I glared at her, feeling my irritation turn to rage. "And whose fault is it that you all act like I'm invading my own home?" Mom pressed her lips together, but didn't answer. "I thought you'd do this for me as a favor," she finally said, and her voice sounded like I'd let her down. Something inside me snapped at those words. I slowly straightened up, nodded coldly, and said, "I won't make a scene. I'll stay in my room, but I'm not leaving." And turning around, I went back into the house, leaving my mom on the porch without giving her a chance to object. Mom looked disappointed, but she nodded anyway, making it clear that she would not insist. "I'll let Emma know," she said, and she sounded like she was hoping I'd change my mind. But I just shrugged, indicating that my decision was final. At dinner that night, Emma, of course, expressed her displeasure. She leaned back in her chair, rolled her eyes, and, sighing theatrically, announced, "I'll just have to reschedule the party at Luciano's since some people," here she paused to look at me meaningfully, "are not ready to compromise." I bit my tongue, concentrating on my plate, and didn't say a word. There was a tense silence in the room. Robert muttered something about the high cost of restaurants. Mom patted Emma's hand affectionately, and Jason, as usual, looked like he didn't care about the whole situation at all. On Saturday, Emma and her friends went to Luciano's to celebrate her birthday. The silence that I've been missing over the past few weeks has finally returned to the house, and for the first time in a long time, I felt real peace. I stayed at home, put on my favorite pajamas, settled on the couch in the living room, and watched old movies all evening, enjoying the comfort and sense of privacy. It was a rare moment when I felt like the mistress of my own house. And, oddly enough, it was this simple night that brought me more peace than all the time that I lived here after returning. My life has become a routine, albeit not the most comfortable one. I went to work, returned home, tried to avoid unnecessary conflicts, and perceived the people living with me under the same roof as neighbors rather than as a family. In the evenings, I'd have a quick dinner and go to my room, or spend time with Megan and other friends I'd reconnected with after moving in. Everything was going well at work. My new boss in Albany appreciated my experience in the Boston office, and a few months later, I found out that I was being considered for the position of team leader. It brought me satisfaction, even if the house was no longer the way I remembered it, even if the atmosphere in it did not let me relax. But at least my career was moving forward. Getting to work turned out to be easier than I thought, and lunch breaks sometimes turned into short trips to familiar places. I drove past my old school, stopped at the park where Dad once taught me to fish, and that was the only thing that reminded me of why I returned to this place in the first place, the city. One evening, at the end of summer, when I returned home, the light was on in the dining room, and I saw my mother and Robert sitting at the dining table with a stack of papers in front of them. Both looked serious, and when I entered, they raised their heads, and the expression on their faces made me freeze in place. "Gaynor," Mom broke the silence first, and there was a strange formality in her voice. "We need to talk to you." My stomach clenched uncomfortably. "Is everything okay? Something happened?" Mom pushed a few sheets of paper towards me, and I picked them up with a frown. "Accounts. For electricity, for water, for heating. We need to discuss the financial situation," Mom continued. "What about this?" I asked, already sensing where the conversation was heading. Robert cleared his throat, folded his hands on the table, and said, "Our expenses have increased significantly since you moved in. Water, electricity, heating, everything has gone up in price." I blinked at them and then answered calmly, "I contribute to the food fund. I give you $300 every month. Remember? That's even more than my share of the meal." Mom and Robert exchanged glances, and that brief glance between them made me clench my fingers on the papers. "It's just for food," Mom said softly. "This does not cover other expenses." I felt a chill rising inside, which had nothing to do with the air conditioner running in the room. "What are you trying to say?" Robert cleared his throat and said bluntly, "We think it would be fair if you paid the rent. You're making enough money." I stared at him in disbelief. "How much?" $1,000 a month. For a second, the room was so quiet that I could hear the ticking of the wall clock. "Are you serious?" I finally managed, and my voice cracked with indignation. "This is my house. Dad left it to me. If anything, I should be the one charging the rent, if anyone here should be doing that at all." Robert's face hardened, and for the first time, I saw in him not just my mother's husband, but a man who really considered himself the master of this house. "Listen here, young lady," he said coldly. "We kept this house in order for 8 years while you were living your life in Boston. We paid property taxes, fixed the roof, replaced the water heater." "I never asked you to do any of this," I interrupted him, barely restraining myself from screaming. "And I offered to help with large expenses, but Mom always said that you covered everything." I turned to her, expecting her to confirm my words, to take my side. But instead, she lowered her eyes and slowly shook her head. "Mom?" I couldn't believe she was actually letting this conversation go on. "These are not the times, Gaynor," she said softly. "We all have to contribute." I felt like something inside of me was breaking. "You can't seriously expect me to pay rent on my own house." "If you can't make a financial contribution," Robert began, but I abruptly got up from the table, causing the chair to squeak on the floor. "Will you kick me out?" I asked, staring at him. Mom jerked her head up, as if my words had just confused her. "Gaynor, no one is kicking you out," she said quickly, but there was no confidence in her voice. "Really? Then what is this if not an attempt to push me out of here?" I didn't expect an answer. Turning around, I left the dining room and went up to my room, slamming the door behind me. I felt like a stranger in my own home. Robert said coldly, "Then maybe you should find another place to stay." The words sounded like a slap in the face, like a blow knocking the air out of his lungs, leaving behind only a hollow vacuum. I slowly turned to my mom, sure that she would object, that she would say at least something in my defense. But instead, she just nodded slightly, agreeing with him. I felt something breaking inside me. I left the room before they could see the tears threatening to fall, before my pride could crack, and only when I closed the bedroom door behind me did I allow myself to collapse onto the bed, trying to process what had just happened. The house was quiet, but the thoughts in my head were thundering, deafening me. I tried to find an explanation, tried to find logic in the fact that my own mother had just actually thrown me out of the house that my father had left me. But the more I thought about it, the more angry I grew. The dream eluded me that night, followed by a series of memories and resentments that now looked much clearer. By morning, I had gone from shock to anger. I was going to work automatically, mechanically performing the usual actions, but inside, I was preparing myself for the confrontation that was inevitable. I knew this conversation would take place, that I wouldn't be allowed to just pretend that nothing had happened. And when I went downstairs for breakfast, the whole family was already there. Mom, Robert, Jason, hunched over his cereal, and Emma, who looked up with an expression of outright triumph. She knew exactly what had happened last night. "So, when will you start paying rent?" "What is it?" she asked sweetly, pretending to innocently stir her coffee with a spoon. "Or are you moving out anyway?" Something inside me broke, but I didn't let myself show it. I carefully placed my cup on the table, straightened my shoulders, and looking directly at her, slowly smiled. "Actually," I said calmly, enjoying the momentary confusion on her face, "I've made a decision." All eyes turned to me. "This house belongs to me," I said in a flat voice, which, despite its outward calmness, had a hint of hardness. "It was left to me by my father. Everyone else lives here because I allow it." I saw Robert open his mouth to protest, but I raised my hand to stop him. "Starting next month, I will set new living conditions. Each of you, Mom, Robert, Emma, and Jason, will pay $500 a month in rent. That's $2,000 in total." The silence in the room was so thick that the air seemed to thicken. Emma broke the silence first. "Are you kidding?" she squealed, looking at me as if I had just offered to sell the house under the hammer. I took a sip of my coffee, feeling a strange calmness spreading inside. "I'm absolutely serious," I said, setting down my cup. "If you don't like the conditions, you can find other accommodation. I'm sure Pinewood is full of rental properties." "Would you kick your own mother out?" Robert stood up abruptly, his face turning purple. I slowly stood up, looking straight into his eyes, not giving him the opportunity to break me with his pressure. "No," I said clearly. "I would just charge my mother and her family a fair rent for a property they don't own." "After all we've done for you," Mom exclaimed, and there was resentment in her voice now. "We kept this house, paid all the bills." "Living here for free," I interrupted, not raising my voice but with enough firmness to make her words hang in the air. "And now you want to charge me rent for my own house? How is this different from what I'm suggesting?" Mom pressed her lips together but couldn't find anything to say. I grabbed my bag and headed for the door without looking back. "Think carefully. Let me know what you decide." The trip to work was blurry, my thoughts were confused, and part of me couldn't believe what I'd just done. But another, stronger part knew it was long overdue. They had gone too far, and something was going to happen. That evening, I took a takeaway. On the way home, I specially stopped at a small restaurant that I had recently found to spend the evening in peace. When I returned, the house was quiet. I walked through the hallway, went up to my room, closed the door, and after laying out the food on the bed, turned on my laptop, deciding to watch a movie. No one knocked on my door. No one even tried to talk to me. And there was something heavier in that silence than the screams and accusations. The next day it was the same, and then another, and another. I became a ghost in my own house, as if I had never been there, as if I was just a shadow, accidentally lingering in this space longer than I should have. Everyone ignored me, even my mother, who was once the closest person in my life. But now she walked by without looking in my direction, without saying a word, as if I had turned into an empty place. 2 weeks have passed in this silence, in this silent alienation, where every step through the house reminded me that I was a stranger here. I bought groceries just for myself and kept them separate in the fridge, cooking during those hours when I knew no one would be around. I washed my clothes when there wasn't a soul in the house, waiting for the moments when I could avoid unnecessary meetings. I missed my mom, the woman who used to stroke my hair before going to bed, who knew how to comfort me when I was feeling sick. But I didn't back down, not this time. And finally, one Sunday afternoon, Mom and Robert cornered me in the living room, as if they had prepared for this conversation in advance, as if they had already decided everything between them and were now just telling me their final decision. "We've made a decision," Robert announced dryly, crossing his arms over his chest. I nodded slowly, showing no emotion, even though my stomach was clenching. "We're leaving," he continued. "We found an apartment on the other side of the city." I still didn't say a word, peering into Mom's face, hoping to see at least a glimmer of doubt, at least a drop of regret. But her gaze was lowered, as if she was ashamed to look into my eyes. A mixture of emotions overwhelmed me. Relief that this excruciating tension would finally come to an end, sadness at the realization that it had come to this, and pent-up anger that they, especially my mother, had initially put me in a position where the only way out was either to bend or push them with this survival game. "When?" I asked, and my voice sounded steady, without trembling. "Next weekend," Mom replied, and I noticed how she swallowed quickly, as if she was trying to digest what she had said. "We've already signed the lease," Robert added. "I'm taking back what I paid for," he continued, with a challenge in his voice. "Washing machine, dishwasher, TV in the living room." "Okay," I cut him off, not wanting to listen to the list of things that he considered his property. "Take everything you bought." The next week was filled with the sounds of packing, slamming doors, and moving boxes. And the whole picture reminded me of one endless torn knot with too many unnecessary threads that had long since lost their strength. Emma took on the role of a dramatic victim, sighing loudly every time I passed by, slamming drawers and closet doors as if to demonstrate how terrible I was, robbing her of her usual life. Jason, as always, kept to himself, avoiding conflict and clearly not wanting to be involved in a family war. Mom barely spoke to me, concentrating entirely on arranging the move, on the boxes, on the things they were going to take with them. And this silence hurt more than I was willing to admit. I couldn't understand how she could choose them, choose Robert and his children, pushing me away with such ease, with such certainty, as if there was no place left in her life for me. On Friday evening, Robert rented a moving truck. I stayed away, watching as they loaded furniture and boxes, as the house gradually emptied, turning into what it was supposed to be, my home, without them. Some of the things they took definitely belonged to my dad. The dining table he chose himself, some kitchen appliances he bought when we were still a family. But I didn't want to fight anymore. I didn't care. It was only when they tried to take out the old grandfather clock that I couldn't stand it. "That remains," I said firmly, stepping out into the hallway. Robert frowned, still holding the heavy watch, but I didn't back down. "I paid for their repairs 3 years ago," he objected. "They weren't working when your father died. This watch belonged to my father," I replied calmly but harshly. "He bought them at an antique store the year I was born. They stay." For a moment it seemed to me that Robert would argue, that he would say something else, bring another argument in his favor. But my mother, who had been silent before, suddenly put her hand on his shoulder and shook her head slightly. They retreated. The last boxes had been taken out, and now the house was empty. I stood in the hallway, watching them make their last trip to the truck. But before leaving, Mom lingered in the kitchen, slowly running her palm over the countertop, as if trying to absorb the remnants of the past. "I never thought it would end like this," she said softly, without looking up. I looked at her, feeling the bitterness of those words, knowing that for her, it was the end of the story, and for me, it was just the beginning. "Me too," I replied, "but you didn't give me a choice." Mom turned away, lowering her head. "I thought you'd be reasonable," she whispered, as if she didn't believe what she was saying. I snorted, shaking my head. "Reasonable?" I repeated. Was it wise to let Emma treat me like an uninvited guest? Was it wise to ask me to leave my own house for her birthday? Was it wise to side with your husband rather than your daughter at every turn? Mom sighed heavily. "Robert has been good to you, Gaynor. He took care of us after your father died." I looked at her, feeling what was left between us finally crumble. "He moved into my house and acted like it belonged to him," I said flatly. "And you let him." Mom pursed her lips, then slowly shook her head. "I see that we will not come to an agreement. I have to go. They're waiting for me." She took a step back, but froze for a second, as if expecting me to stop her, to say something that would change everything. But I didn't say. "Goodbye, Mom," was all I said. She nodded, turned away, and walked out the door. And that's how they left. A house that had seemed crowded and hostile for months suddenly became painfully empty. That first night alone, I wandered from room to room, pausing in doorways, peering into empty spaces that had recently been filled with intense, steeped in hidden hostility. I was automatically calculating what was left and what I needed to replace. The sofa and TV were missing from the living room, the microwave and coffee maker were gone from the kitchen, and the 3 bedrooms were now empty, without beds or dressers, leaving behind a feeling as if the house had shed a heavy, alien shell and was finally able to breathe freely. But instead of the sadness or loneliness that I expected to feel, a strange feeling of peace came over me. It was my home. It's really mine now. Not a place where I had to coexist with those who considered it my own, but a space in which I could do whatever I wanted, fill it with things, people, sounds, and silence of my choice. I could make it a home again. The next day, I went to the nearest home improvement store and bought a new sofa, a coffee maker, and basic kitchen supplies. I ordered a bed frame online and scheduled the delivery of a new mattress for the weekend. And then I did a general cleaning of the whole house, opened the windows to let in fresh air, allowing a light autumn breeze to enter and fill the rooms with freshness. Strangely, even this simple gesture, to open the windows and let the wind sweep through the corridors, blowing away the mustiness and tension of the past months, seemed symbolic, as if I was finally getting rid of something old, heavy, unnecessary. On Monday, I returned to work with a light heart, and it didn't go unnoticed. "You look different," my manager commented, peering at me over the laptop screen. "In a good way?" I asked, raising my eyebrows. He chuckled. "More relaxed," he said. I smiled, shrugging my shoulders. "I'm home." And it was true. That evening, Megan stopped by to see how I was fixing up the house. She whistled as she walked through the half-empty rooms, looking curiously at the things that were not yet fully arranged. "Wow, they really got out of here," she remarked, opening one of the kitchen cabinets, now half empty. "Yes," I nodded, putting aside the boxes of new plates. "But now I can start all over again. Make it your own again." She helped me arrange new furniture, find a place for the sofa, and then together we hung up some photos that I framed. Pictures of my father, fishing with him by the lake, graduation photos, shots with friends from Boston. When we finally settled on the new couch, sipping wine from coffee mugs, because I hadn't had time to buy proper glasses yet, Megan suddenly asked, "Do you regret it?" I thought about it, rolling the mug in my hands, watching the dark surface of the wine reflect the light of the lamp. "No," I replied slowly. "I miss my mom, and I wish things had turned out differently, but I don't regret standing up for myself." She nodded, and we fell silent, enjoying the silence that no longer seemed tense or hostile. Now it was a silence in which I felt at peace. My birthday was in early October. I didn't expect to hear from my mom, but the silence still hurt. Aunt Susan called in the morning, congratulated me, and, slightly lowering her voice, awkwardly mentioned that she had recently seen her mother and Robert at the grocery store. "They seem to be doing well," she said cautiously. I waited for her to say something else, perhaps that my mother had asked about me, but my aunt fell silent, and in that silence there was already an answer. "She didn't even ask how I was doing?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level, but I felt like everything was shrinking inside. Aunt Susan sighed. "Give her time, Gaynor. She's stubborn, just like you." I didn't say anything. I'm not in contact with my mother or her new family right now. They didn't tell me their new address, and I didn't ask. Mom didn't even call me for my birthday, and even though I tell myself it doesn't matter, it still hurts. But it also gave me the ultimate answer to all my questions. Her priorities were with Robert and his children, not with me. I hear from my relatives that everything is fine with them, and that's enough for me. I live alone, but for the first time in many years, I don't feel lonely. I feel peaceful. This is my home, and I got him back. Whatever the future holds for me, I know I made the right choice by standing up for myself. My father would be proud.